When Mason Carter bought his quiet piece of rural property, he thought the biggest problem he'd ever have with his neighbors would be the occasional fence dispute or someone's dog wandering onto his land. He was wrong. His trouble started with an HOA Karen who somehow decided that Mason's tractor was too loud, even though that same tractor was the only reason the neighborhood's private access road stayed clear and usable. At first, Mason tried to ignore the ridiculous fines, assuming common sense would eventually win. But then the HOA pushed too far and demanded that he stop using his tractor altogether. Bro, that decision was about to create a disaster nobody in that neighborhood saw coming. Because Mason didn't threaten anyone, didn't argue, and didn't make some dramatic scene. He simply stopped doing the one thing everyone had taken for granted. And when the consequences finally hit, the HOA realized just how badly they had underestimated him. Mason Carter had never considered himself a troublemaker. He was the kind of guy who preferred fixing a problem with his own hands rather than sitting around arguing about it, which was exactly why he had invested in a compact tractor after buying his property on the edge of a rural development called Pine Ridge Estates. His land sat at the end of a narrow private access road that connected several homes to the main highway. The road looked harmless in good weather, but after heavy rain, fallen branches, mud, and overgrown vegetation could make it nearly impossible to pass. Mason had cleared that road for years, mostly because he needed to use it himself, but eventually everyone in the neighborhood started benefiting from his work. Nobody formally asked him to do it, and nobody paid him for it. He simply handled it because leaving the road blocked meant everyone suffered. 2. When Mason Carter bought his quiet piece of rural property, he thought the biggest problem he'd ever have with his neighbors would be the occasional fence dispute or someone's dog wandering onto his land. He was wrong. His trouble started with an HOA Karen who somehow decided that Mason's tractor was too loud, even though that same tractor was the only reason the neighborhood's private access road stayed clear and usable. At first, Mason tried to ignore the ridiculous fines, assuming common sense would eventually win. But then the HOA pushed too far and demanded that he stop using his tractor altogether. Bro, that decision was about to create a disaster nobody in that neighborhood saw coming. Because Mason didn't threaten anyone, didn't argue, and didn't make some dramatic scene. He simply stopped doing the one thing everyone had taken for granted. And when the consequences finally hit, the HOA realized just how badly they had underestimated him. Mason Carter had never considered himself a troublemaker. He was the kind of guy who preferred fixing a problem with his own hands rather than sitting around arguing about it, which was exactly why he had invested in a compact tractor after buying his property on the edge of a rural development called Pine Ridge Estates. His land sat at the end of a narrow private access road that connected several homes to the main highway. The road looked harmless in good weather, but after heavy rain, fallen branches, mud, and overgrown vegetation could make it nearly impossible to pass. Mason had cleared that road for years, mostly because he needed to use it himself, but eventually everyone in the neighborhood started benefiting from his work. Nobody formally asked him to do it, and nobody paid him for it. He simply handled it because leaving the road blocked meant everyone suffered. 3. Mason started documenting everything, taking photographs of the road after storms and keeping records of his tractor usage. He wasn't looking for revenge. He simply wanted proof that he wasn't abusing anyone's patience. But while Mason was gathering evidence, Brenda was apparently building her own case. One afternoon, another HOA notice arrived with a warning that Mason could face escalating penalties if he continued operating the tractor in a manner the board considered disruptive. The message also strongly suggested that road maintenance should be handled through the HOA instead. Mason stared at that sentence for a long time. Because as far as he knew, the HOA had never maintained that road themselves. They had simply gotten comfortable with Mason doing it for free. And that was when Mason stopped seeing the situation as an annoying neighbor dispute. He started seeing it as a choice. If the HOA wanted control over the tractor, Mason realized, then they were also going to have to accept responsibility for everything the tractor had been doing. He just hadn't decided yet how much that lesson was going to cost them. Mason decided to test the HOA's new rule without breaking a single part of it. He stopped using the tractor on the access road and began keeping it parked inside his property. He didn't send angry messages, threaten the board, or announce what he was doing. He simply followed their instructions exactly. And almost immediately, the neighborhood started noticing the difference. The first problem came after a strong storm swept through Pine Ridge Estates, dropping branches across the narrow road and leaving several sections covered in mud. Normally, Mason would have been outside before breakfast, clearing everything with his tractor before anyone had to worry about it. This time, he stayed home. For by midday, residents began struggling to get through. A delivery vehicle had to turn around, and one resident found himself carefully navigating around a fallen branch that covered half the road. Then Brenda discovered what Mason had already understood: the HOA had no equipment ready to handle the mess. Their supposed solution had been to stop Mason from using his tractor, but nobody had bothered figuring out what came next. That's when the complaints started flying in. People who had barely noticed Mason's work for years suddenly wanted to know why the road wasn't clear. Some blamed the weather, others blamed the HOA, and a few finally started asking why Mason had stopped maintaining it. Brenda reportedly insisted that Mason was being unreasonable, but Mason had something she didn't expect: the original notices. He had followed every restriction exactly as written. Then the HOA sent him another warning demanding that he resume clearing the road. Mason read it twice. Bro, this was the moment everything flipped. The same organization that had fined him for operating the tractor was now demanding that he operate it again. Mason didn't argue. He simply kept every document, every photograph, and every notice together in one folder. Because now the HOA had created a problem that couldn't be solved by blaming Mason. And Mason was finally ready to let them discover that problem for themselves. The real turning point came 3 days later when another storm rolled through Pine Ridge Estates. This one was worse. Heavy rain turned the dirt shoulders into thick mud, several large branches came down across the access road, and one section near the drainage ditch became almost impossible for ordinary vehicles to navigate. Under normal circumstances, Mason would have fired up his tractor and cleared everything within an hour. Instead, he looked out from his porch, saw the mess, and remembered the HOA's warning. He had been told clearly that operating the tractor could result in further penalties. So Mason did exactly what they had demanded. Nothing. By the next morning, the road was effectively blocked. That's when the neighborhood's attitude changed. Residents who had previously treated Mason's maintenance work like background noise suddenly realized how much they depended on it. People started calling the HOA, asking when the road would be cleared. The board apparently promised that someone would arrange maintenance, but hours passed with no equipment showing up. Meanwhile, Mason continued documenting everything from his property. He photographed the fallen branches, the muddy sections, and the untouched road. He wasn't celebrating the inconvenience. He was creating a record. Then Brenda made what might have been her biggest mistake. She sent Mason another notice accusing him of intentionally refusing to maintain the road and demanding that he immediately restore access. The message reportedly referenced his previous responsibility for road maintenance and suggested that the HOA could pursue additional action if he continued to neglect it. Mason actually laughed when he read it. Not because the situation was funny, but because the contradiction was almost unbelievable. The HOA had fined him for using the exact equipment necessary to perform the work, then demanded that he perform the work anyway. That's exactly how people act when they believe rules only apply in one direction. Instead of responding emotionally, Mason gathered everything. He had the original noise complaint, every fine, every warning, photographs showing his limited tractor use, records showing the road maintenance he had performed over the years, and the HOA's later demand that he resume the same work. He also checked the neighborhood's governing documents and discovered something important: there was no clause requiring him personally to maintain the road with his equipment. The HOA had simply become accustomed to him doing it. Mason sent one carefully written response to the board. He explained that he was willing to comply with the HOA's restrictions, but he would no longer operate equipment that the board had specifically prohibited him from using. If the HOA wanted the access road maintained, it would need to arrange and fund that maintenance itself. Then he waited. For several hours, nothing happened. And then his phone started filling with notifications. Residents were posting pictures of the blocked road in the neighborhood group. People were demanding answers from the HOA. Some were furious that Mason had been fined over tractor noise when the tractor had been keeping the road usable. Others were asking why the board had never established a proper maintenance plan. Brenda tried to shift the blame back onto Mason, but this time the evidence was already sitting in front of everyone. The HOA had created the situation themselves. Then came the moment Mason had been waiting for. An emergency board meeting was called. Brenda reportedly entered that meeting expecting Mason to apologize and agree to resume clearing the road. Instead, Mason arrived with a folder containing every notice they had sent him. He didn't need to threaten them. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply laid the documents on the table and let the timeline speak for itself. The board had demanded that he stop using the tractor. He had stopped. The road became inaccessible. Then the board demanded that he start using the tractor again. Mason looked around the room and calmly made one point clear: he wasn't refusing to help. He was refusing to be fined for helping. And suddenly, the HOA had nowhere left to hide. The emergency HOA meeting started with the kind of tense silence that told Mason everyone already knew something had gone badly wrong. 7 Brenda Whitmore sat near the front of the room with several board members, surrounded by folders and printed notices, apparently prepared to defend every decision they had made. Mason sat across from them with his own folder resting on his lap. He wasn't there to create a scene. He wasn't even there expecting an apology. At this point, he simply wanted the contradiction documented clearly enough that nobody could pretend they didn't understand what had happened. The board president began by explaining that the access road was a shared community resource and that residents had a reasonable expectation that it would remain accessible. Mason listened quietly. Then came the familiar suggestion that everyone needed to work together and that the recent problems were unfortunate misunderstandings. Bro, that phrase alone would have driven me crazy. After weeks of fines, warnings, and accusations, suddenly everything was just a misunderstanding. Mason opened his folder. He placed the first notice on the table, followed by the second, then the additional warning. Each one documented the HOA's objections to his tractor use. He then placed photographs showing the road before and after storms, along with his personal records showing when he had used the tractor and what work he had performed. Finally, he placed the HOA's demand that he resume maintaining the road. The room reportedly went quiet. There was no dramatic speech. Mason didn't need one. The paperwork told the story better than he ever could. He had been fined because the tractor was considered too noisy. He had changed his operating schedule. He had reduced his usage. He had complied with the restrictions. When the HOA eventually ordered him to stop using the tractor altogether, he had stopped. The moment he stopped, the road became difficult to access. Then the HOA demanded that he start again. That was the contradiction nobody could explain. One board member finally acknowledged that the HOA had never formally assigned Mason responsibility for road maintenance. The board had simply relied on him because he had always done it voluntarily. That admission changed the entire atmosphere. Mason then explained the part that had bothered him most. He hadn't minded helping. In fact, he had enjoyed knowing that his work made life easier for everyone. What bothered him was being treated like a nuisance while simultaneously being treated like unpaid maintenance staff. He had been fined for doing the work and then criticized for stopping the work. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for the same thing the HOA had demanded from him all along: consistency. That's when several residents started speaking up. One homeowner admitted that she had assumed the HOA arranged road maintenance. Another said she had never realized Mason was clearing fallen branches after storms. A third resident mentioned that the access road had remained usable for years because Mason routinely repaired the worst sections himself. The more people talked, the clearer the truth became. Mason had never been the problem. The HOA had simply taken his voluntary help for granted. Brenda still wasn't ready to let the issue go. She argued that Mason's tractor really had been disruptive and that residents had the right to quiet surroundings. Mason didn't challenge that point. He simply reminded everyone that he had already agreed to reasonable restrictions. The dispute wasn't about whether residents deserved peace and quiet. It was about whether the HOA could prohibit him from performing maintenance and then punish him when the consequences became inconvenient. That distinction finally landed. The board voted to suspend the tractor-related fines and remove the warnings from Mason's record. More importantly, they voted to establish a formal maintenance arrangement for the access road. Instead of expecting one homeowner to handle everything, the HOA would contract with a local service provider for storm cleanup and seasonal maintenance. Residents would contribute through the community budget, which was exactly how a shared responsibility should have been handled in the first place. Mason also received something he hadn't expected. An apology. It wasn't some huge emotional confession, and Brenda certainly didn't suddenly become his best friend. But the board president acknowledged that the HOA had handled the situation poorly and that the fines had been applied without properly considering the practical consequences. For Mason, that was enough. But the story didn't end there. Once the board reviewed the records, another issue surfaced. Several previous fines had been issued based on complaints that didn't clearly establish actual violations. Mason's documentation showed that some of the alleged tractor activity had happened outside the times described in the complaints. The board decided to review those notices as well. Within a few weeks, the remaining penalties were reversed. Mason wasn't getting rich from this. He wasn't trying to destroy the HOA. He simply wanted the record corrected and the ridiculous cycle to end. The biggest change, however, happened among the residents. People started treating Mason differently. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged him before began thanking him for all the work he had done over the years. A few admitted that they had never thought about what happened to the road after a storm because it was always magically clear by the time they needed to drive through. One neighbor even told Mason that she had assumed the HOA had paid someone to handle it. That realization seemed to embarrass a lot of people. Because the truth was painfully simple, everyone had benefited from Mason's work, but almost nobody had bothered to notice it until the work disappeared. And Brenda. Her position on the board became increasingly uncomfortable. Residents began questioning other decisions she had supported, especially after the tractor dispute exposed how quickly a minor complaint could turn into a major community problem. She eventually stopped attending some board meetings and later resigned from the board. Mason never celebrated her resignation. He didn't organize some victory party or publicly humiliate her. As far as he was concerned, the issue had already been settled. That was probably the most satisfying part. Mason had never needed to defeat Brenda personally. He had simply followed the rules she insisted upon. The consequences did the rest. A few months later, the new maintenance system was fully operational. After another heavy storm, a contractor arrived with proper equipment and cleared the road without anyone expecting Mason to do the work. The HOA finally had a predictable maintenance plan, and Mason could use his tractor on his own property without constantly wondering whether another complaint would appear in his mailbox. Ironically, the tractor that had once been treated like a neighborhood menace became almost invisible again. Mason still used it. He still maintained his land. He still helped neighbors when he genuinely wanted to. But now there was a clear boundary between being a good neighbor and being responsible for everyone else's problems. And that boundary had cost the HOA a blocked road, an emergency meeting, several embarrassing reversals, and a lesson they probably should have learned before issuing that very first fine. The funniest part was that Mason never actually retaliated. He didn't damage anything. He didn't sabotage the road. He didn't deliberately create an emergency. He simply stopped volunteering after the HOA told him that his equipment was unacceptable. Everything that happened afterward was the natural consequence of removing something the community had quietly depended on. And honestly, that's what made the whole situation so satisfying. Mason didn't have to fight the HOA. He just stopped doing their job for free. Looking back, Mason's story is a perfect example of how entitlement can turn a simple favor into an invisible obligation. The HOA didn't realize how valuable his help was until they took it away themselves. Bro, that's the part that genuinely gets me. Mason never needed some dramatic revenge plan. He simply followed their rules, and reality handled the rest. Sometimes the best comeback isn't destroying someone or getting even. It's calmly stepping back and letting people experience the consequences of what they demanded. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood drama, and share this with someone who has ever dealt with an HOA that took things way too far.